1 Kings chapter 9 tonight. And we're going to continue our study. I thought, should we take a break and do? Let's just keep going on our study. I think there's some blessings to the continuity even through the Christmas season, just to continue our study through and keep building a brick at a time on what we've been studying here together about King Solomon and his strengths and weaknesses. So you should have a handout in front of you. If you don't have one of those, just go ahead and slip your hand up. I see a guy in the back waving papers around. He'll make sure you get one. So the handout for tonight, our typical fill-in-the-blank handout. The beginning of our lesson here tonight is about success and straying. And I warned you last time as we looked at some of the stuff from 1 Kings chapter 1 Kings chapter 9, about Solomon and God's second appearance. You remember, God has appeared to Solomon now a second time, right in the middle of his reign. So 20 years has gone by. Solomon has built his home. He's built the temple. And God appears to Solomon because what's about to happen is Israel now at its highest point. We're going to look at the heights of Israel's prosperity tonight. And we're going to look at how at the heights of Israel's prosperity, something horrible happened to Solomon. And is that his heart turned away from the Lord. So we looked at some protective standards for the king last time that God had laid out in the book of Deuteronomy. And I copied those over onto your handout tonight just so that you can have those there for remembrance as we go through the prosperity of Solomon. Because what's going to happen here, in a sense, is we are going to look at chapters 9 and 10 tonight. And it's going to be essentially a list of how Solomon broke all of those protective standards that God had placed for the king. And how he did them all in prosperity. And it's the liberty, it's the freedom, it's the prosperity that sometimes is the hardest trial of all for us, the hardest test of all. Because we feel like when we can do anything we want, maybe we should do anything we want. But in reality, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And that goes for a lot, so we won't move forward into Christian liberty just yet into the New Testament. That's not really the venue of what we're talking about tonight. But it certainly is one of the major applications you can draw from Old Testament stories like these. So success and straying, we've been going through, again, the big picture. This is from the Bible Project. If any of you have seen the videos from the Bible Project, they are generally very good summaries of books. Again, I think he was off on some of his stuff. We talked about some of these, but we're through this part where we saw David succeed Solomon. He says, Solomon, be strong and show yourself a man, and he does that. He establishes his rule over the kingdom. He asks for wisdom, builds the temple, and now we're going to look at Solomon's downfall beginning in chapter 9 here. So let's go ahead and look at the scriptures together. So open your Bible to 1 Kings chapter 9. And let's begin in verse 10. Now it happened at the end of 20 years. So we see this number again, 20 years, right? So this is God appears to Solomon at that 20-year mark. Now it's at the end of this 20 years. When Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house, Hiram the king of Tyre had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress and gold as much as he desired. That King Solomon then gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. And Hiram went from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, but they did not please him. So he said, what kind of cities are these which you have given me, my brother? And he called them the land of Kabul, as they are to this day. Then Hiram sent the king 120 talents of gold. Now, there's going to be a section in here, and I always go back and forth. You know, I love publicly reading the scriptures. I think is an important thing for us to do. You'll notice we do it at almost all of our gatherings, if not every one of our gatherings. So it's actually a New Testament command: give heed to teaching, to exhortation, and to reading. That is one of the commands of the epistles. the pastoral epistles. So we do those three things. But I'm actually going to skip verses 15 to 28 because it's an extended section, and it really is just some of the details about what Solomon builds, and I'll outline those for you in the outline. So here's what happens. Solomon raises a slave labor force. He builds a bunch of stuff. There you go, paraphrase. So let's go to chapter 10 and verse 1. Now when the queen of Sheba heard the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. Then she came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels that bore spices. By the way, a retinue, if you can picture this, have you ever seen the Disney movie Aladdin? Remember when they're kind of coming in? Well, I'll set it for you. Make way for Prince Ali. Are you with me now? I'm sure you've probably all seen that. Okay, this is in a sense, I think, what you're supposed to be picturing as we read this. This retinue that's coming in. Now, I'm pretty sure they didn't have a genie who was dancing around. I think it's pretty safe to say they didn't have a genie who was dancing around. But they're coming with this retinue or this caravan of impressive wealth. So they came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels that bore spices, very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for the king that he could not explain it to her. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. That's a statement that describes the fact that she was just awestruck or amazed. Then she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes. And indeed, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard. Happy are your men, and happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord had loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness." Now notice those two words. I think it's interesting that as she talked about this, all of this prosperity, from what does it flow? Wisdom, justice, and righteousness. So where does prosperity actually come from? From wisdom, justice, and righteousness. Notice those words. That's not a large part of the lesson, but remember that idea. Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great quantity, and precious stones. There never again came such abundance of spices as the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Also the ships of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought great quantities of almug wood and precious stones from Ophir. And the king made steps of the almug wood for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, also harps and stringed instruments for singers. There never again came such almug wood, nor has the like been seen to this day. Now King Solomon gave the queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, besides what Solomon had given her according to the royal generosity. So she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants. So we have this passage that's describing to us the amazing prosperity of Solomon. So it starts with this little exchange between Solomon and Hiram, and it's giving us a picture of Solomon's business deals. So you remember, if you were here in previous weeks, you might remember the detail here that Solomon forged a trade alliance with Hiram to provide wheat and oil in exchange for timber, stone, and gold. So remember, Israel doesn't have the trees Lebanon has, but Lebanon doesn't have the fields that Israel has, doesn't have the olive trees that Israel has. So it became a natural a natural thing that when Solomon was going to build great buildings, that they would forge this trade alliance, and it was very successful for both nations. Hiram was a very close friend of Solomon, and now you have happening this business deal. So what happens now? They've been doing this for 20 years. Israel sends wheat and oil, and Lebanon sends down trees and gold and stone. And it's a good deal for everyone. But now you've been doing this for 20 years. Even a good thing after 20 years gets tiresome, right? So Solomon is kind of, and some commentators think he might be kind of finishing the deal. In a sense, we've got everything we need now. Some think it's just a continuation. We don't really know. But after 20 years of trade, Solomon is now going to gift a portion of northern Israel's border area to Hiram. This is part of Asher's territory that God had defined. You remember when the land of Israel, when the people of Israel came into the land, they conquered it. Once they drove out the larger nations, God divided the land amongst the 12 tribes. And he gave this part of the land to Asher. And God set up rules, you remember when he set up the land, that there was a thing that the land would always remain in the family. It's a very interesting arrangement, and when you think about the theological consequences of that, Israel was supposed to be the inheritance of the people of Israel forever. And if they followed the Old Testament law as given whenever a piece of land was sold, the actual ownership of that land, even though it was sold, was not actually given to another person. That person, in a sense, was renting that land until the year of Jubilee, and it would go back to the original family that owned it. So the land was supposed to stay in the families eternally. This was God's plan for the nation of Israel. So what Solomon is doing here is he's kind of giving Hiram this area of the nation of Israel, which was given to Asher. Asher's the tribe of Asher. He's giving it to Hiram. Now, it makes perfect sense in a business arrangement. But what's the problem with this? God had said this land is supposed to be an inheritance for the people of Israel forever. Solomon's giving it away. So if you want to put a little check mark in your little box on the right-hand side there about these standards that God had set up for the king, you'll notice one of them is making a foreigner ruler over the people. And what Solomon is essentially doing is he's making Hiram leader over a portion of this, and he's giving it to the king of a foreign nation, which means that this land is not going to come back into the ownership of Israel in the year of Jubilee, although Israel never kept the year of Jubilee like they were supposed to. But he's giving this actually to another country. So this is a problem. Now, when you have all this stuff, what's a couple of border cities? Is it a big deal? And the answer is yes, it is. But Solomon, I think, he's beginning to lose his perspective. Now, as Hiram says, oh, he's giving me some of these border areas, he goes down and he looks at them, and he's like, what is this? It's interesting the way the Bible records these quotations for us. And probably he sent a letter back to Solomon, which included this phrase that's recorded for us. What are these cities which you have given to you, my brother? Now, obviously, Hiram is not upset with Solomon, like somehow they're going to go to war with each other. But he looks at these cities and he essentially turns them down. When you put the section from 2 Chronicles together with this one, you'll find that Solomon actually built these areas up later on in his reign. So Solomon is going to maintain control of this area because Hiram's going to look at them, probably undeveloped country towns, and he's going to go and say, why do I want these? There's nothing special here. And as he does that, he's going to call them Kabul. And if you look up the meaning of the word Kabul, it means worthless. He's like, why do I want that? That's not of any value to me. And he turns them down. So it's kind of interesting, right? Because it describes for us a little bit about the prosperity of what's going on. Because this trade deal that Hiram has with Israel has created such prosperity that at this point in history, Hiram is actually looking at land territory. Like, what was it, 20 cities? In modern, in Galilee, if you're familiar with that term from the New Testament. He's going to look at this land and he's going to say, I don't want it. Wait a second. Dude, the guy is giving you land. I don't want it. Unless it's like a really nice area, I don't really want it. That's really saying something, right, about the prosperity of this time. So in the middle of all this, we're getting these pictures, right, of the prosperity. Hiram doesn't really need or want more land. There's nothing of value there. It's just more trouble for him. So he gives them back to Solomon. He calls them worthless. So they exchange some gold and they just kind of move on. But along this kind of normal business deal, you see Solomon beginning to slip because he's giving away the promised land to other peoples, to other nations. And this is something that he was told he wasn't supposed to do as a king. So here's the section then. The next section is about Solomon's labor force that he raises. So we looked at this a little bit in chapter 5 earlier on. So when you read this, it says, and this is the reason for the labor force which King Solomon raised. This is verse 15. And built the house of the Lord and his own house, the Millo, the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Now, we're going to come back and do a little bit of look. I told you we're going to take a little rabbit trail and talk about biblical archaeology, because from this segment we have so many building projects that happened. It kind of begs the question, if you're thinking about the scriptures, wait, is there any evidence of this historically? Because if Solomon did all of these building programs, there should be some evidence if you get a shovel and go looking, right? So we'll do a little bit of a rabbit trail next time, but we're not quite there yet. So Solomon is going to raise this labor force, and he's going to build tons of stuff. So he's going to place Adoniram over the forced labor. That was 514. So he's got his tiered system of organization where he's got leaders over the different segments. He's got a leader for the army, a leader for the priests. He's got a leader for his labor force. So he's got this guy Adoniram. We saw that in actually chapter 4 and chapter 5. But he's got to get forced labor, because in order to build all this stuff, you need people. And they don't have front end loaders and backhoes. They're doing this all by hand. I mean, maybe treadmill cranes, I think is about as far as they get in technology at this point, where they've got some kind of counterbalance happening and lifting, but not very much. So enslaving Israelites was forbidden by law, but conscription for labor in military forces was not. So if you read the Old Testament law about enslaving people, it wasn't allowed. The only way that an Israelite could be a slave is if they were in extreme poverty and they had a debt that they could not pay. One of the ways for them to get out from under that debt was to allow themselves to become slaves or indentured servants, but only for a period of 7 years. There was a maximum amount of time that was allowed. You'll find this, I think it's in Exodus chapter 21 and Deuteronomy 17. I didn't write those in my notes, but it's in a few different places. So, but slavery of Israelites was not allowed. So what Solomon did is he conscripted this labor force. And you remember what they did? He hired a bunch of people, and he would have them as paid laborers on shifts. So they would have 1 month of work for Solomon, and then they would have 2 months of work off. And then throughout the course of the year, they would work 4 months. They had 3 groups. Each group would work 4 months. 1 month on, 2 months off. 1 month on, 2 months off. I say that right? I get that right? The 3s and the 4s get turned around in my head when I'm saying this. So he drafted paid laborers from Israel that he sent in shifts. and they did skilled labor and administration. So what's interesting is that Solomon, and this would be a positive thing, I think, as we're reading the scriptures on this, Solomon did not enslave his people to build these, but he did conscript them. What's interesting is that this conscription, of course, was unpopular with Israel, but it was predicted. You remember Samuel, when the people came to him and said, hey, we want a king. And Samuel's like, but do you really? Because if you have a king, you know what he's going to do? He's going to take all the best of you, and he's going to take you, and instead of letting you use your gifts, to build up your family and your inheritance, he's going to take the best of you, and he's going to use them in his court. And he's going to take the best of everything you have. And this conscription that Solomon did was very unpopular with Israel. Now remember, if you've got a farm, because this is what Israel did, they farmed wheat, vineyards, barley, and olive trees. These were the four things that Israel's agriculture, centered around in growing seasons. Of course, they had sheep, they had cows, cattle, amongst those things as well. As you go through the course of the year, you can imagine all of those different harvests, the planting and the harvesting of all of these things are going to come for you at some very difficult times, most likely, right? Because if you're conscripted into labor and all of a sudden you and your kids or the majority of your workforce has to all of a sudden go, build for Solomon when the wheat harvest is about ready to come in, you've got a problem, don't you? So now you're counting on friends and family to help you get stuff in, and you can imagine that this is an extra burden for the people as they're trying to figure out all of this stuff through the course of the 4 months that they have to work for Solomon on and off. So this is ultimately, you remember, what split the kingdom from Solomon's son Rehoboam later on. Because the people came to Rehoboam and said, man, your father's killing us. So you get the good Pastor Ray paraphrase on these, right? Man, your dad, he was tough. You got to lighten the load here because this is too much. And you remember Rehoboam gave that famous statement. He said, my father's little finger shall be like my thigh. You think dad was bad. I'm going to be worse. So this is very unpopular with the people. So we're reading about this. Solomon is actually laying the foundation for his own son's demise later on through these unpopular programs. So he's doing amazing things, but he is also driving a wedge between himself and his people. So prosperity is a great thing. Progress is a great thing, but sometimes progress comes at too high of a price. So beware. Beware that you don't end up paying a price with prosperity that you're not willing to pay. So Solomon would conscript his own people, but he didn't enslave them, which was a good thing. But Solomon did enslave the Canaanites. So you remember God said, when you come into the land, utterly destroy the people. So they were supposed to either drive out or destroy every Canaanite, and there's a whole list of ites, right? There's Ammonites and Perizzites and, all of the ites. But Israel was unfaithful. You remember the book of Judges chapter 1 tells us that when Israel came into the land, rather than destroying the people or driving them out like God said, they put them to tribute, was the word that was used. They just taxed them heavily. They went, wait a second, God said get rid of these people, but we could also use them, right? So you see Solomon continuing a practice which God, by the way, said was not good because it wasn't obedience. God said utterly drive these people out. Now there was a group of people that they made an agreement with, right? That they couldn't destroy, but these people were supposed to be driven out or destroyed. And that same command is true because they are a danger to the people. So he enslaved these people and he used them to be, according to 5:15, the burden carriers. So, in every workplace, there are the jobs that the guys who have been there for 50 years do, and then there are the jobs that the guys who were just hired last week do, right? So ask Joe what those jobs are at the metal shop, because when he worked, he was summer help at the metal shop. Guess which jobs he did? Okay. They stuck him in the box with a grinder when it was, 95 degrees outside, Those are the jobs that aren't real great. So what Solomon did is he enslaved these people who weren't the Israelites, and he made them do the lousy jobs. They were the ones who had to drag the stones. They were the ones who had to do all the hard work. And he let his people be the supervisors and the administrators. And they would be the ones who were doing the skilled labor as part of that. So I think that finishes that segment. Let's see, that finishes that segment on Solomon's labor force. So this is where the people came from to do all of these things. So let's look at then what they did. What were some of Solomon's accomplishments? And as you read these accomplishments are something. I mean, when you think about this and when you think about what these guys are doing with the technology that they have, I mean, we take some of these things for granted. I mean, if we quarry stones and we drop them into places, if you go up to the Tippecanoe County up here, right, and you look at Northport, they've got this big breakwater that goes around the dock up there. I can remember when I was a kid before the dock was there. And if the wind was wrong, the boats couldn't come in because, there was no way they were docking a boat when there were, 8-footers coming across the front of the dock. So they went and they got these great big stones and they built this big breakwater on either side. It's really kind of a cool project, and they can handle all that traffic at Northport now that they used to have to either go around to Gills Rock if the wind was wrong, or, an amazing feat of engineering. But have you seen the size of those stones? I mean, some of those stones are like as big as this half of our seating area here. I mean, that's a big stone. How did they move those stones? Some of you have probably seen it, right? I mean, they blast them out with dynamite. They pick them up with cranes. They throw them on a truck. They move them from the truck to the barge, and then the barge lifts them off of the crane and drops them in the water. How many guys did it take to lift those stones? You say, well, one guy lifted that stone every single time. Well, the guy who was driving the crane, and the guy who was driving the truck, right? And the guy who was moving the barge. So the stuff that these guys did is really amazing. The fortifications that they built. I mean, we're talking about some serious engineering of technology in these days. So Solomon is going to make significant improvements to the fortification of the entire nation of Israel. So if you're reading this, and I'll pull up a map for you here in just a second, but if you're reading this, what Solomon is doing is he's making improvements across the entire nation. And he's really building three things in the different parts of the nation. And again, the guy is brilliant because he's not doing this in one spot. He's not putting all of his eggs in one basket. He's got this stuff spread out across the entire nation from north to south. Really, really smart. So he's doing three things. He's building storage facilities to house food. Number two, he's building garrison facilities to house his armies and his chariots. So he's building stables, he's building places where these things can be kept. The chariots can be kept, the horses can be kept. He's got armories in these places, most likely as well. So he's building these garrison facilities, and then he's also building military fortifications to protect the cities from invasion. And if you look at where he's building these, there's a couple listed here. There's a few listed earlier from the north, a few listed from the south. He's building these in Gezer, which is down here. He's building these Beth Horon, Baal. Oh, that's that one right there. And Tadmor. He's got these different places. And these are all in the south, but if you were to see the topography of the land, in these plains where the kind of the mountains are coming together and you have these places where you can drive chariots and march armies, where do you think the cities are that he's building? He's building in these strategic locations. And in these strategic locations, there are fortifications, there's garrisons, and there's food. What do you need to fight a war? What do you need to keep the armies, invading armies at bay? You need supplies and you need materials to fight those wars. You need places for them to hide. You need fortifications, military fortifications. Solomon is building these in strategic locations all the way through the south. He's also doing this up in the north. You heard about earlier on about in verse, I think it was verse 15 or verse 16 when we read that. It said he did this at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Hazor, Megiddo in the north, Gezer in the south. So there's kind of some main cities and then some smaller ones where Solomon is keeping food, military supplies, and building fortifications. It's a brilliant strategy. And he's not just doing it here, or he's not keeping it all in Jerusalem where he can see it. He's spreading it out because if an invasion comes from the south and he loses some of that, well, that's okay because they've still got fortifications and food and supplies and everything in the north, and they can move those around. So it's a brilliant strategy that Solomon is doing. So around Jerusalem, he is the Bible is telling us he's building the wall. Remember, we have a whole book of the Bible about building the wall of Jerusalem. Here, it just gets a side mention. Oh, it's like, oh yeah, and we did the wall too. Okay, we've got Nehemiah that describes everything and how God, in miraculous, difficult circumstances, allowed this wall to be built in record time. Here in 1 Kings, everything is so prosperous. It's like, oh yeah, and the wall too. Not so impressive. But you remember the wall that Solomon builds is going to stand up to for years against invading armies. So Solomon greatly improved the fortifications around Jerusalem. So they did the wall, but he also built this thing called the Millo. Now, I will say this. When it comes to a few things in this chapter, we're kind of guessing on what they are. But we can tell from what's being said about them that they are impressive. The Millo comes up multiple times through 1 Kings. We don't exactly know what it is. But the people who seem to know the most about what they're talking about usually come down in one of two places. The Millo was either a fortress along the wall of Jerusalem, so it was kind of like a castle on the corner. So when I play Age of Empires, I know I've got like 4 guys in here who understand this, so at least I can hit half of you with this, right? When I build my fortifications in Age of Empires, I always build a castle right on the corner because that's got the most attack, it's got the most hit points, so defensively that is the best building I can build. Some people think that what Solomon did is he built the Millo, which they say was, in essence, a castle on the wall that protected one of the most vulnerable points, where there would be a place then that was extremely strong, an extremely strong fortification with the ability then to have as many men as possible defending it in the most, with the best defenses. Possibility 1. Number 2, some people say the Millo was a series of terraces around the city of Jerusalem. So because Jerusalem is built on a hill, it's kind of hard to build your house on a hill. Any of you build your house on a hill? Look like you might be part of Whoville or something like that, right? Where your house so you got to flatten the ground off before you can build. Now that does 2 things, right? If you build terraces around the mountains, it does 2 things. Number 1, when you build those terraces, it creates a bunch of retaining walls that all of a sudden makes it pretty difficult to get around, right? Because these retaining walls are, in essence, mini fortifications and multiple ones all the way along. So the Millo could have been this fortress, or it could have been a series of terraces around the city that ultimately made invasion harder and construction easier. So whether it was a terracing program around the city, some people say, or whether it was that fortress, either case, it's an impressive engineering feat for Solomon to have done. So he accomplishes this building in the south, he accomplishes this building in the north, he accomplishes this building around Jerusalem, building these fortifications, these impressive engineering feats all along the way. But aside from that, he's also going to build a ship of build a fleet of ships, not a ship of fleets, a fleet of ships with randomly capitalized words all over the place, because that's what I do. He's going to build a fleet of ships for international trade. Now, what's interesting about this is he's going to keep them at Ezion Geber. Now, I love saying Ezion Geber. It makes me feel like I'm riding a horse. Ezion Geber. All right. I don't know why I said that, but I did. Okay. So where is Ezion Geber? Well, he's also going to keep some ships on the Mediterranean Sea. If you cross-reference 2 Chronicles chapter 9 and verse 21, it says he's got some ships heading up to Tarshish. You remember where Tarshish is? Tarshish we find really in the book of Jonah. Tarshish is in modern-day Spain. That's where, when God told Jonah to go to Nineveh, which was this way, Jonah jumped in a ship and went to Tarshish, which was as far as he could go the other way, literally the end of the earth. So he's keeping ships at Ezion Geber, and he's keeping some that are heading out to Tarshish every year. So the ships look probably like this, something like this. Now, this isn't an actual picture of Solomon's ship. It's a very low-res photo as well. But we're not talking about, 19th century military frigate-sized ships. We're talking about ships that are medium-sized ships here, smaller ships that are designed, however, for long voyages, because these voyages are making it from Israel all the way to Spain. Now, they're not doing it quickly, though, because we find out along the way that it actually takes them 3 years to get there and back. But where is Ezion Geber? I know you're all going, Ezion Geber. Okay. All right. That's down here, right on the Red Sea. So you remember Israel is in a very strategic location, right? Because if you pull out your world map, okay, this goes out to Southeast Asia, India. This goes through northern Africa. So by ship, they are able to trade with everything along the North African coast, with everything along the East African coast, and everything all the way along the bottom here, all the way over to India. So even in this day, this is where a lot of things were happening. So Solomon is keeping ships here and here. He actually worked out a deal with Hiram, that Hiram would have some ships. Hiram would help him build the ships. And Hiram would provide him with experienced sailors who would know how the ships work and train their guys to do it. It was a pretty good deal for both of them, right? Because Israel has access, because they have control of this area. By the way, it's called the Negev. You might run across this in your Bible translations, but they have access to the Red Sea down here, which opens them up, if they have ships, to all of this. Hiram doesn't have access to that, right? He's Lebanon. He's got the Mediterranean Sea. So this is a pretty good deal for both guys. You see how smart Solomon is? He's like, hey, I got something you want. You got something I want. It's a pretty good deal, right? And then he learned that they could both benefit from these things. So they built a fleet of ships for international trade. The ships would go to this place called Ophir. Now, we don't know where Ophir is again. It's actually mentioned in the book of Job. Ophir is the name of one of Shem's descendants. So we're assuming that it's listed in the Table of Nations. So we're assuming that as the nations dispersed after the flood, this area was named after one of Shem's descendants. So they're returning from Ophir with a lot of gold, precious wood, exotic animals. Like we're given this list of all this stuff, like they're coming back with apes and they're coming back with this almug wood. Again, this stuff, what is that? Okay, I don't know, but whatever it is, they were building essentially of its day Stradivarius violins out of it. They were building instruments with this almug wood that just it was incomparable to everything else. It was beautiful wood. It was incredible structure. It had long-lasting properties. They're coming back from Ophir with this stuff. So where is Ophir? Well, we don't know. Good guesses. Some people think southern Arabia, like the map I had up here before. Some people think Ophir is just down here. This is the end of the Red Sea here, between, where Africa comes close to Arabia here. They think that's it. But honestly, the ships are going out and they're coming back after 3 years. I think that seems like an awful short voyage for a 3-year voyage, don't you? So some people think Eastern Africa, down the coast, down by Madagascar, down that way. But most likely, probably, India. Solomon is sending ships that are making it all the way to India, which for its day is an amazing feat of engineering and courage, that these guys are sending ships to go so far. They're going out and they're coming back. 3 years it takes them to go out and come back. So these trade voyages would last 3 full years. Impressive. So some people will actually say they have found engravings in South America that seem to talk about King Solomon as well. We don't really know if that's true or not. But the whole known world knows about King Solomon because he's sending ships literally all over the world. From Tarshish, which is Spain, all the way to probably India, certainly South Africa area, if not to India then. I mean, everyone knows about Solomon because as these guys are going out, they're bringing the word of Solomon all around. So that brings us to the next segment then, which is all about Solomon's fame. So we're looking at his building programs. He's got this international trade program going. He's got it going with Hiram. He's got it going, literally to the ends of the earth. Tarshish and Ophir. I mean, what this guy has going is just amazing. So now, as his fame is going out on all of these ships, we read this segment about Solomon being visited by somebody called the Queen of Sheba. Now, where is Sheba? Guess what I'm going to say? We don't really know for sure. Our best guess is Sheba was probably in modern day Yemen. Okay, I was going to say it's in here somewhere. I was looking at the subpoints. Most likely modern day Yemen. It's the best watered portion of the Arabian Peninsula. It had a strong international trade because it was right down there on the bottom, right on the corner. It was a great place for them to be able to have ships that would go back and forth. Of course, easier for them to reach out to India, South Africa, in those areas, so they could stretch farther than Israel would. So word of Solomon's fame was likely carried by the traders on all of these extended voyages, right? So, I mean, you can just see Solomon is just growing bigger and bigger. Word is spreading. The ships are going out. I mean, it's really just amazing what's happening. So the Queen of Sheba comes because she hears about the wisdom of Solomon, and she thinks, if this guy is half as good as what I hear, he's going to be amazing. So she goes to visit him, and you remember when she gets there, she actually says, man, what I heard, I never thought it would be true, but it's actually twice as good as what I heard. She said the half has not yet been told. She's like, you're twice as good as what people say about you. So she comes and she's going to test Solomon's wisdom. And when she tests Solomon's wisdom, she's going to find it exceptional. She brings hard questions. Anything that's in her heart, any question that she has, Solomon answers her questions with his great wisdom. She's going to view Solomon's kingdom and she's going to find it well organized and joyful. And the Bible's going to list all of these things, right? Like the way the servants are seated, the clothes that they wear, the dishes that they use. It's like everything about Solomon's kingdom. It was just like a well-oiled machine. The guy was brilliant and everyone just followed. And it was just this amazing organization that Solomon had. All of this stuff was just going, firing on all cylinders. They're just one after the other. Everything is just amazing. So she comes with her caravan. And she trades with Solomon with all of these exotic spices. And the Bible makes this statement about how there was never any more spice and exotic things like this than when she came. So you notice how we're at like this pinnacle. Everything's a pinnacle, right? Everything's a high point. So you appreciate those spices, right? We had lunch today at Mongolian barbecue. It's like the Mongolian barbecue. Really do enjoy it. I like the noodles. But you go over and they got this bar full of all of these sauces you're supposed to put on your stuff. How many of you like that? I like that. I'm like, ooh, a little chili this, a little garlic that, a little sesame here, a little burn your village barbecue. How many flames does that have on it? Ooh, I'll take some of that. Mmm. Yum. See, he's got it. So they've got all these spices that they've never had before and never had again. Imagine living in that time, right? I mean, we live in a time like this right now. Do we not? We have great reason to be thankful for everything that we have. We have access to so much. So the Queen of Sheba ultimately is going to glorify the Lord for his blessings to Israel. There's going to be this kind of like little poetry she gives about how God was so kind to put Solomon in. And you remember those 3 words I gave you, which were so important. And it's not what the lesson is about tonight, but right, wisdom, justice, and righteousness. That's what a nation needs. Wisdom, justice, and righteousness. That's where prosperity comes from. But anyway, that's a rabbit trail. We won't go down that hole tonight. So she's going to glorify the Lord for all of these things. So here's where it finishes, and we'll finish this out. I'm just going to buzz through. If you read the rest of chapter 10 and into chapter 11, it's going to just say, oh yeah, and by the way. Let me give you a few more details about Solomon. And every single one of these details, if you really stop and think about them, is a jaw-dropping detail. Solomon brought in a yearly income, and the Bible gives it to us in talents. Is it 660 talents? I think it says in verse 14 of chapter 10. 660 talents of gold. You know how much that is? 25 tons of gold. 25 tons of gold was his yearly income. Imagine that. So what are you going to do with all of that gold? And by the way, it's not, the Bible continues, well, this is what he brought in every year, but there was also all this other income that came in from taxation, and then, the other nations that were around would pay tribute to stay on Solomon's good side, and there's kind of like, oh yeah, well, that was, that's what the IRS knew about, but there was this other stuff too, that came in on the side. It's unfathomable. So what is Solomon going to do? The Bible says he makes golden shields with it, some big ones and some little ones, hundreds of them. Like guys are supposed to go out to battle with shields made out of gold. Really? Well, it's better, the gold is better than leather, right? A lot of times they're making shields out of like wicker, covering them with leather. And that's what they would carry out as a shield to battle. So this is an improvement, is it not? In some respect. But he makes hundreds of these. They go into the temple treasury. They're actually going to disappear later on. The Bible's going to record that for us. But this is, okay, so what are they going to make out of all this gold? Well, they're going to make shields out of this gold. Wow. So then Solomon is going to make himself a throne. What is he going to make his throne out of? When you've got this much gold coming in every year, what are you going to make your throne out of? Well, they built steps out of this almug wood that they also used to make musical instruments. That was, extremely beautiful and strong. And well, he made steps out of almug wood. He made his throne out of ivory, the Bible tells us, and overlaid the ivory throne with, guess what? Gold. Next to that golden throne, he has 12 lions. Guess what they made them out of? Anyone want to guess? Gold, right? Yeah. See, Daniel's got it, right? This place I mean, silver, everyone had silver. Silver was nothing. The Bible actually comments in this section about how silver was so common, it was like, oh, I don't want silver. So he makes 12 golden lions. The comment is made, no other king ever had a throne like this. Almond wood steps, golden lions, ivory throne overlaid with gold. I mean, just this, opulence, right? I mean, it's just amazing. Solomon, of course, made all of his dishes out of, guess what? Gold. Eating on golden plates, drinking out of golden cups, with golden forks and golden spoons. I mean, we have it good here. I like my silverware, But golden. Solomon is receiving gifts from rulers. The Bible says from all over the world. Everyone is sending gifts to Solomon, so he's getting exotic animals. He's getting exotic spices. He's getting gold. The gold from Ophir was particularly noted in this. If you kind of read the passage, it talks about the gold from Ophir. Like, as you read that, you're like, ooh, Ophir gold, Why it is that way, we don't really know, but the people in that day noted that there was something special about the color or the quality of that gold, whatever it was. So he's got gifts from rulers all over the world. Describes how he has a massive army of chariots and horsemen. Describes how he's importing horses from Egypt for himself and even selling them to the surrounding nations. And that finishes chapter 10, and then it comes into chapter 11, and it says, and Solomon loved many foreign women. In fact, so much so that he had, aside from his wife, Pharaoh's daughter, who holds in the story up for the first 20 years apparently, a place of honor and singleness, as best we can tell, is his wife. But now Solomon has what? 700 wives, 300 concubines, which are, women in his house with whom he has the right to procreate, even though they might not have the full privilege of being a wife. But 1,000 women at his disposal.
They must have name tags.
Well, like we always say, I have a hard enough time keeping one. So you read this story and you just go, wow. Talk about blessing and prosperity. But where does it go from here? Solomon was great, but. And here's the thing I hope we can learn from this segment of Scripture, that when people talk about us, are they going to talk about, they're great, but. And the but is a big but. And what is the but? His heart went away from the Lord. That's the but, the only but that really matters, right? Solomon had all of this stuff, but he didn't have the Lord because his heart went away from him. And if you can have all of this stuff, but all of this stuff takes you away from the Lord, is it really good stuff to have? So while we talk about eating on golden dishes, sitting in golden chairs, surrounded by golden lions, do you really want that? Remember what David said, right? Lord, don't give me too much, so I stop trusting in you. Don't give me too little, so I have to beg. Give me just enough. So while we see this as a great time in the nation of Israel, a great time of prosperity, it's also a time of, really a dark time, of Israel turning their back on God and learning to love the blessings of God while turning their back on the God who gave the blessings. So let it not be said of us that we would be like these people. While we live in a time of great success, certainly our nation mirrors this, does it not, today? We live in a time of great success. Compared to the rest of the world, we live in palaces. We eat on essentially golden dishes, right? With exotic foods from all over the world. I mean, open up your spice cabinet. What do you got in there? Got some turmeric in there? You got some curry in there? Where did that come from? Well, I got news for you. They didn't grow it in your garden. Okay. That came from some of that stuff. I mean, you live in this kind of a time of blessing. But none of that matters. What matters? Kind of nestled in this is the example, a very interesting example that Jesus himself used, was the Queen of Sheba. You remember Jesus at one point in his ministry looked at the Pharisees and he said, the Queen of Sheba is going to rise up in judgment of you. And why is that? Because she came from afar to hear the wisdom of Solomon. But you, okay, and here's the implication. As Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees, he said, but you have someone greater than Solomon right here, and you don't even care to hear what he has to say. She went so far to hear something, to hear the great wisdom. You are turning your back on it because you have it so. So let it be a lesson for us. And you can go back to that front page on your sheet, and you can look at all of those things that are listed on the front page of that sheet, by the way. All of those things that God told Solomon not to do. Did he multiply gold? I think the golden throne and the golden dishes and the... Did he multiply horses? He did. Did he give rule to foreigners? Yep. Did he multiply wives? Did he return to Egypt? No. He didn't, but he did go down to Egypt for horses, which is actually one of the things that was particularly mentioned in that passage. Did he write a personal copy of the law? We don't know the answer to that question. The Bible does tell us along the way in this passage that 3 times a year Solomon went to the temple and sacrificed, which would match up with the calendar supposed to come during the great feasts and worship of the great feasts. So Solomon was at least following through with at least the outer forms, even though his heart was going away from the Lord, which is, I guess, means nothing. But did he write a personal copy of the law? Probably not, would be my guess. Did he read it daily? I think it's pretty safe to say no. So see, God told Solomon what to do and what not to do. He didn't listen. He let his standards lax. Let these things in here that were going to challenge his heart, that were going to steal his heart away from the Lord. And where did he end up in the end? Exactly the place God said he would end up if he wasn't careful. So it's a lesson for us. It's a lesson that what is ultimately our hearts and where our hearts are with the Lord. So let's learn from the lesson of Solomon while we enjoy the blessings of God so that we don't end up in the same place he did, because it's all downhill from here. All right, that's where we'll go ahead and finish for tonight. Remember, the next time we'll meet is in the new year. So 9:30 is when we start in the new year. So we are going to start on time. So please remember that as you go through your mornings. So I know sometimes not everything is conducive to being in time. I understand. Okay, there's weather, there's family, and all the rest of that. But we'll get going on time. And if you come in late, that's fine. But we'll get going one way or the other. So we have our last session of the exchange on Sunday morning. So ladies, who has your section? I know it's been a couple of weeks. So Megan and you, and then I think it's Andrew for the big group out here, and then we'll talk about what's coming next during our Vision Sunday coming up here. So if I can grab the deacons for just a minute or two. I have some planning stuff for next year I need to talk about with you for just a minute before you guys go home tonight. So if I can grab you guys in the boardroom, that would be helpful for me. Otherwise, have a great night, guys.